necessary amendments from the opposition are accepted, I'll vote against it. The bill before the House today is, of course, the result of last-minute crisis talks. But it's instructive to remind ourselves where the government started. Through the initial bill, the Andrews Labor government sought to lengthen the total period for which a state of emergency declaration can remain in force from 6 months to a further 12 months. It sought to lower the threshold for the Chief Health Officer to exercise state of emergency powers. These powers will be able to remain in force, the bill made clear, and indeed the bill before the House today makes clear, even if the Parliament has been cancelled and even if there is not one single case of COVID-19 in the Victorian community. Now, we know that under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, the declaration of a state of emergency allows the state government to exercise quite extraordinary powers. The Premier has sought to reassure Victorians that these powers only relate to largely uncontroversial public health measures, like the wearing of masks and social distancing. The Premier has said to Victorians, the bill is, and I quote, a bit technical, so bear with me. The Premier, in saying so, is not only condescending, he's not telling the truth. State of emergency powers are not technical, Acting President. They enable the government to control the movement of people, to ban gatherings, to enforce isolation or quarantine, to close businesses, to shut down this Parliament, to search premises without warrants, and to order arrests. They are astonishing powers. They terrify many Victorians. So with case numbers on the decline, the Andrews Labor government wants to wield these powers for many, many more months, powers that can, of course, slash to ribbons both our economic and social fabric. It's entirely understandable, therefore, that so many Victorians, upon the announcement of this plan from the government, believed that they were part of a scheme to keep them locked down indefinitely. Instead, as Mr. Atkinson said in his contribution to the House, I think in a very compelling way, what we desperately need is a responsible plan to open the windows, to unlock the door, and to let the air and light of economic and social recovery in. Well, what's the government's argument in favour of this bill today, Acting President? Let's examine it. Let's analyse it. Firstly, the government argues to necessity. We cannot go from stage 4 to stage 0 overnight. Quite right. I agree. Numerous members, however, have already made plain that there is no need for this extension and expansion of such repressive powers. The opposition, of course, has already put forward a responsible and prudent plan of its own, one which would allow necessary measures to remain in force, of course with strict oversight. I commend that plan to the House. The argument to necessity, therefore, has already been comprehensively refuted. The government contends nonetheless that we should trust it with these extraordinary powers. The Premier has said that the legislation, and I quote, does not change how long our current lockdown will last or increase the restrictions we face. So the government says we're extending and expanding the powers that we have over your lives without oversight, but trust us, we won't use them all. Trust is an idea with a long and fascinating democratic heritage. Members of the government are interested in the history of democracy. Some weeks ago, after refusing to answer questions in this House, Ms Makakos took to Twitter in a failed effort to convince the world that she's actually a great respecter of democracy. In doing so, she referenced the Athenian statesman Pericles. Well, Ms Makakos and I share Hellenic heritage. So if we're to stick with the Greeks, in thinking about the bill before the House today, it isn't Pericles that we should turn to for guidance, but another famed Athenian statesman, Demosthenes. Demosthenes said this: "There is one safeguard known generally to the wise, which is an advantage and security to all, but especially to democracies against despots." What is it? Distrust. Distrust. Over the millennia since Demosthenes spoke these words, governments of all persuasions have shown themselves in need of strong measures to ensure accountability and to bring scrutiny, all built upon an appropriate foundation of popular distrust. Now, I talk even of competent governments. Acting President, this lethally incompetent Labor government, which lies and obfuscates, requires scrutiny and limits upon its power more than any other government in our state's history. So I will not vote to hand it more open-ended power over Victorians, let alone in the absence of sittings of this place. Allow me to explain why. It's as if Herbert Spencer had a crystal ball. In 1884, the great liberal philosopher wrote Man versus the State, a book that should be required reading for every member of this place. In a chapter entitled The Sins of Legislators, he drew what I feel is a particularly powerful and pertinent analogy. He said this: a druggist's assistant who, after listening to the description of pains which he mistakes for those of colic, but which are really caused by inflammation, describes a sharp purgative and kills the patient, is found guilty of manslaughter. Quite right too. Spencer goes on: we measure the responsibilities of legislators for the mischiefs they may do in a much more lenient fashion. The recent mischiefs of this Labor government have been many. They speak to the government's argument today: trust us. And like the druggist's hapless assistant, the government's mischiefs have been deadly. We all know about hotel quarantine. It was staggeringly stupid, perhaps criminally so, to task supervision of returned travellers to untrained security guards. Now we have a hard lockdown, replete with work permits, a curfew, and whole industries shut down. The number of sick, dying, and dead continues to mount by the day. All the while, livelihoods are trashed, and family violence, depression, and even suicide are the result. Victoria's current malaise, as everyone knows, was caused by the hotel quarantine scandal. 99%. 99%. It is a deadly and damning statistic that is so infamous in Victoria that it requires no further explanation. Trust us, nonetheless, says the government. Its failures instead demand distrust, and therefore that this bill, as it stands, be defeated. But this government's incompetence, this government's untrustworthiness does not start and finish with the hotel quarantine fiasco. Other significant blunders were made that also played a large part in Victoria's ongoing second wave. That second wave, of course, is what necessitates our debate today about whether and under what circumstances the government should have ongoing recourse to state of emergency powers. In short, the extraordinary lack of liberty in Victoria today is in large part the result of the government's ineptitude in failing to properly use various powers that it now seeks to extend. Liberalism is often misunderstood. Those of us who proudly adopt that title have never believed that individuals should be able to do whatever they please. Since liberalism emerged as a coherent doctrine in the middle of the 19th century, its proponents have always argued that actions likely to cause harm to others should not be permitted. This is the famous so-called harm principle that John Stuart Mill explained in 1859 in On Liberty. So Liberals have often led the charge in calling for harsher penalties and even for less freedom for those who represent a genuine danger to society. We have done so, again, in an entirely responsible way at this time of pandemic. Critics of liberalism cry, hypocrisy. How can the lovers of freedom be advocating for less? Yet, as the economist Milton Friedman explained, one of the basic roles of government in a free society is, and I quote, to enforce compliance with the rules. Thinking about trust, as the government has invited us to do today, let's see how it's performed against this most basic metric. When the ill-fated hotel quarantine program was established, we were told that a key element would be the testing of people before they left. Of course. Otherwise, those highly likely to have contracted the virus would be out in the community, infecting others. However, back in June, the government informed a stunned Victoria that 30% of people were waltzing out of hotel quarantine without being tested. The government couldn't enforce the rule, its own rule, we were told, because it would breach people's human rights. Then last month, the Premier again shocked the state when he revealed that more than 1 in 4 sufferers of COVID-19 were not at home when called upon by an official. Strict isolation in your own home, he said, was the rule. Quite right. The Chief Health Officer then shocked us tenfold when he explained that this rule was simply not being enforced. Instead, those with confirmed cases of this highly infectious virus were, in fact, entirely free to move around the community, even without a mask, putting the rest of us at risk. Enforcement of the rule, we were told, would contravene Victoria's Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. Madness. These glaring failures were belatedly rectified, putting the lie to the government's initial explanation. However, others still persist, demanding distrust and consequently scrutiny and a limiting of solely executive power rather than its expansion as proposed in the bill before the House today. Contact tracing and the monitoring of those in isolation at home are cases in point. Many of those who've tested positive to COVID-19 have reported that nothing was done to check on their compliance with stay-at-home rules. No phone call, no knock at the door, nothing. And those who somehow have been found to have broken the rules are given the wet lettuce treatment, a $1,652 fine. For weeks, the Premier doggedly refused to tell us how many of these fines had been issued. Well, we now know why. Of more than 800 people who were not at home when called upon, only 42 fines were issued. Now, the appalling and ongoing contact tracing failures have already been thoroughly explored and explained by my friend Ms Crozier. The government's use of the powers it seeks to extend gives Victorians no cause for confidence. And as a direct result of these various bungles and catastrophic failures, the entire rest of the state is being forced to endure the most draconian impositions that our country has ever known, harbingers of untold social and economic destruction. If the Victorian government was a proverbial druggist's assistant, it would have been hauled off to jail or perhaps the scaffold long ago. So no, I will not trust the government with even greater powers through until next month. The right approach, the responsible and prudent approach to the need for some ongoing public health measures has been discussed by a number of my opposition colleagues. Instead of fixating only on measures that could keep us locked down, the government should finally ensure COVID patients are properly isolated and contacts traced. It should finally turn its collective mind to the development of an exit plan, a recovery plan, to seek to fix some, just some, of the extraordinary damage it has inflicted upon our state.